Hello, my name is Michael Smook. Today is June 10th. It's a Sunday, and we're in the year 2018. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today, we're going to be talking about reform related to the criminal justice system. We're going to be critiquing the mayor's plan. It's called Smaller, Safer, Fairer for Closing Rikers. And then we're going to expand outward and talk about other topics that relate to that. And in terms of today's outline for episode 25, which is entitled Second Chances, chapter 2 is entitled Definitions. Chapter 3 is entitled Inside the Auditorium. Chapter 4 is entitled What's Trending. And chapter 5 we're going to call, appropriately, Concluding Thoughts. Some of the things that I'm going to be talking today sound progressive. And normally I save all of my progressive ideas for YouTube talks, or if I write it, Google Plus essays. Several years ago, I'm at someone's home. It's a social occasion. We're going to watch the Super Bowl. And instead, atypically, I start talking about progressive ideas. And one of the people I'm talking to says, Michael, how are we going to pay for all these things? And I said, look, the people we're talking about are already hungry, poor, unemployed, and frequently homeless. We're already paying for it. We're either going to pay for more prisons or pay for effective governmental programs. So as I like to think about it, as I said to this fellow, and I tell you today, is that we're all in this together. So now that I've summarized chapter 1, introduction, let's move forward on this talk, chapter 2, definitions, and today it's episode 25, Second Chances. In terms of definitions, in order to talk about criminal justice reform and the mayor's program, what we need to do is we need to go over some baseline definitions. It'll help the conversation between the two of us. For example, what's the difference between a jail and a prison? A jail is usually administered by local government, a city or a county. People who are awaiting trial or serving a sentence usually are there on a misdemeanor charge, and the sentence is usually 1 year or less. People who are in a prison, which is administered by either a state or the federal government, and people are there on grand larceny, which is a felony. Other felonies, which they could be there, include drug trafficking and a homicide. And the sentences are usually far longer. So that's the difference between a jail and a prison. Why people go to jail or prison, it relates to punishment. When I think of the word punishment, the words deterrence, retribution, restitution, and incapacitation come to mind. We have to budget our time, so we'll talk in some detail about 2 of the 4 words. Deterrence. When I think about the word deterrence, what goes in my mind is I think about a film I saw. It was a Sean Connery film. It was about 15 years ago. I saw it on TV. I don't think I went to the movies. Anyway, Sean Connery doesn't play James Bond in this movie. He plays a career criminal. And he says to his son and his grandson, they're both adults, and he's trying to dissuade them for a life of crime. And he says, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. And that nails it right on the head as far as what deterrence is about. The other word we're going to define under the heading under the title of punishment is incapacitation. Incapacitation aligns with another I word, incarceration. It means basically the same thing. When you are incapacitated because you're in a jail or a prison, your ability to move about is somewhere between very difficult and impossible. You are behind tall, high walls ringed with barbed wire. That's the outer part of the detention facility. And you sleep in something called a cell, which usually has bars on it. And your ability to move about depends upon the head of the jail or prison, the warden, or the correction officers. So that's what incapacitation about. Two other words let's define before we move on. Rehabilitation and recidivism. Rehabilitation starts when you're already serving a sentence. It could involve treatment for drug or alcohol dependence. It could involve education or vocational training, which you can receive in prison or via Skype in the prison. And so basically, once you've served your time and you are released, between your own hard work and intestinal fortitude, there are programs in place to help you stay on the straight and narrow so you can have a job, pay taxes, perhaps have a family, and avoid going back into jail or prison again. That's what rehabilitation is about. In terms of when you fall short, or an individual falls short, and society falls short, and that means that that person goes back into jail and prison, and they seem to be recycling in and out, and there is a cost to society in terms of what kind of comes out of your paycheck and what we pay for taxes. So that's what recidivism is about when we fall short. Now that I've gone through definitions, that will help us with this talk about the closing of Rikers Island, smaller, safer, fairer, the mayor's plan, and then we'll expand outwards. So this chapter 2 definitions is going to help us with this conversation today. Chapter 3 is entitled Inside the Auditorium. I work in a governmental agency involved in, for a long time I've been there, and I work involved in administration and finance. From the administration end, what I do, one of the things I do is I'm involved in coordinating logistics for meetings and public hearings. So in terms of what I need to do that job is I work with building operations, security, and information technology to make sure the meetings and or public hearings, everything flows and everything works. And one day, about 4 years ago, I received a phone call from a small sister municipal agency you've probably never heard of. It's called the New York City Board of Correction. The Board of Correction is involved in monitoring the activities of the jails throughout the city of New York. The jails are administered on a day-to-day basis by the Department of Correction. And the board has monitoring responsibilities, and they also have authority over the department, and they share that authority with the city council and the mayor. So I received the phone call, and this was unusual. They wanted a one-time only public hearing, but they had such a good time. It was such a productive endeavor that we had 12 public hearings over 12 months, average of one per month. In order to do that, since this was kind of unusual, I received approval from higher authority in my agency, and we were able to move forward. And in addition to working with support units in my building, I worked with the support staff of the Board of Correction to make this work. Now, the reason why this chapter is important inside the auditorium is because the board, which was running we were hosts, my agency, but the board is running the meetings. They're running the meetings, and they are in charge, and they have an agenda, and there are 3 other groups that were inside the auditorium that had an agenda that day, and it's important what they said, because in some ways they converge, and in other ways they diverge. And what this is about is, this chapter is reform in the criminal justice system is really hard, even when you have the best intentions, and sometimes you have to take half steps instead of big steps. But this is for the greater good, and society benefits overall. And let's go through this. But that's my point, and I'm giving you, in a way, a spoiler alert in the beginning of the chapter as to what's going to be at the end of the chapter. So what happens with the Board of Correction, there are 9 board members, and then there's an ex officio member who's a non-voting member, but that person is the executive director, and she runs the board agency on a day-to-day basis. We put them on the stage of the auditorium, and we give them chairs and tables, of course, and they have stationary microphones. And everything is being recorded by a cinematographer and a stenographer. And they're elevated 3 or 4 feet above the auditorium. The auditorium seats 210 people, which is a major reason why they wanted to use this facility for a public hearing. And we had local press, so that was kind of cool. And we had local TV, Channel 1 for local TV. So what happens is, what seems most important to me is the opening remarks of the board. And this first of 12 hearings resonates inside me. It's very clear, crisp memories of what happened. The first board member, he's a physician, and he emphatically, from the get-go, he points out the inhumane treatment inmates are receiving at the hands of correction officers, which is a violation of their 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. Correction officer improperly laying the hands on inmates and administering beatings on them. And at the time, the board member, this physician, knew that the federal government's U.S. Attorney's Office was going to sign an agreement with the city of New York, signed off by the mayor, in which there would be on-site monitors of the federal government who would monitor what's going on, write reports, and take corrective actions. So this physician who made the opening comments said, we need to close Rikers Island, and we need to replace it with a more humane environment, and we need a more decentralized approach. Put smaller facilities throughout the 5 boroughs. And that speech he gave resonates inside me even now. There was a second board member who also spoke about violation of 8th Amendment rights. She was a retired family court judge and an attorney, and she was concerned that we have minors, 16 and 17-year-old teenagers, who are either awaiting trial or serving a sentence on misdemeanors, and they were in the general population of adults. And in order to defend themselves, because they're frequently attacked by other inmates, once you get into a fight, even if you're in the right, you are put in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is also referred to as punitive segregation. And what this board member says is, she's citing criminologists and mental health professionals and other lawyers who say that minors being in solitary confinement has an adverse impact on their overall mental health and is a form of torture. So what happened is, she said that, she also added that what happens is people who are in solitary confinement over long periods of time could, there's a continuum of what bad things can happen. They could have short-term mental health problems, long-term, and in some cases, long-term mental health problems. And also she cited that these young people, they should be treated as juveniles and not in an adult prison. And at minimum, for now, what we needed to do was, they were a vulnerable population, along with women and people with mental health and drug abuse problems, and they needed further protection from the system. So those were her opening remarks. The other 7 board members had opening remarks, but those 2 board members, one a doctor, one a retired judge, they said things that are really important, that resonate inside me today, and I think relate to, when we go to chapter 4, we're going to be talking about reform that's being implemented. So keep in mind, we're going to be talking about, we need to, the city brought this upon themselves, and we need to keep this in mind. Now, in terms of the other groups that were in the room for this chapter 3 inside the auditorium, what we're talking about is there was another group, the Department of Correction. The Department of Correction gave testimony with the commissioner and his senior staff. Senior staff were plainclothes people, and in addition, part of his senior staff were two uniformed correction officials. They had the rank of either general or colonel, and they were either wardens or assistant wardens. You have to remember, on Rikers Island, there are 10 jails. And also in detention facilities in the other 5 boroughs off island are 5 detention facilities. So everyone gave an opening statement, and they spoke to the board. The board is elevated. They're on a stage, and they're 3 feet taller. And the commissioner of the Department of Correction, which runs the jails, and his senior staff are at a podium, and they're looking upward at the board. They're giving opening statements, and they're having a dialogue back and forth with board members. And it was a productive, business-like meeting. The conversations were civil between each other, and it was very enlightening. The board was suggesting, what do we do about 16 and 17-year-olds in punitive segregation, and separating this vulnerable population from the general population. The commissioner and his senior staff were very understanding, and they were saying, we'll do whatever you want, but we need authorization and appropriation, first from the city council, and then we need the mayor to sign off. And then after all of that, what we need to do is we need to have a timeline that's agreeable to all the stakeholders involved. And so this was good conversation. And then after that, there are a third and fourth groups that entered into the mix that made this day particularly interesting. And among all 12 hearings, this is the one I remember best. Even though I'm in and out of the auditorium, and I'm following what's going on through the New York Times, going online, looking at the internet, and sometimes watching what happens on TV. So what happens is you have to understand, while this is going on, it's packed, the auditorium. Nearly all 210 seats are filled, and at least a third of the people in the auditorium who were watching what's going on, they are men and women in blue. They are correction officers. In terms of race, ethnicity, composition, they are black, white, red, yellow, brown folks. And they are the elite of correction officers. You could see on their epaulets ranks of anywhere from general stars to other symbols for people who are colonels, majors, captains, or lieutenants. And while the board is making its opening remarks, while the commissioner is making his remarks, and then he and the senior staff are answering questions, you could see nearly all of the correction officers, 1/3 of the audience, have their arms folded and this grim face look. And to me, that was a nonverbal clue that something was going on here. And what I read into that was this is a very important meeting, and they're hearing things that are unpleasant to them, and they're not necessarily going to agree with a lot of stuff being spoken about. So, so that was a clue. And then the third speaker who came up to the podium was the president of the Union of the Court Officers. And he's a fiery guy. And he's a warrior in a suit. And he says to the board, he says, what I'm hearing in this public hearing today is my court officers who come into work every day in harm's way, dealing with a very difficult population of inmates. They are being slandered by the board and the department. And so he says, what I'm reading in the newspapers, in the New York Times, in the tabloids, they're being libeled. And they deserve a pat on the back and our support, and I object to what's being done. So he then answered some questions from the board, and he left the auditorium. And this stays with me. It was kind of a shock to hear this. All 70 or more correction officers stood up with a smile on their face and loudly applauded as the president of the union left the auditorium, and that certainly had a big impact on me. And I'll summarize what it all means at the end of this chapter. The fourth group in the auditorium represented the rights of inmates. They were administrators, lawyers, mental health professionals who represented non-governmental organizations that they're 24/7, 365, they're concerned about the treatment of their clients, inmates. They want to see that people are treated in a humane way. There are programs available to treat them for drug addictions, mental health problems, training, educational and vocational training, so they can be rehabilitated when they are released, and and they're also when they're set free. So they also were concerned about other areas of reform, and we'll talk about that in a second. What the areas that they're interested, and also including with this group are family of people who visit inmates at Rikers, and also former inmates at Rikers. They all made opening statements. They're all defending the rights of inmates, and they're all supportive of reform. And this is the group. This is the fourth group. Now, I think the thing to keep in mind is that the board on stage and the department that runs the jails were pretty much in harmony with each other. The correction officers union head, he's a fiery leader, and he had a different agenda, but in a way it sort of overlaps with people he's diverging from. And he feels that his court officers are they're doing the really tough, difficult jobs, and they're being criticized over it. And he's trying to do the best he can to defend them in the court of public opinion, which is through the media, TV, the internet, and print journalism. And then those who are defending the inmates are rightfully supporting on Eighth Amendment rights violations in terms of cruel and unusual punishment, beatings of inmates by correction officers, punitive segregation, and they're also talking about violation of Sixth Amendment rights. In particular, the Khalif Browder scandal. This had to do with a young man 10 days shy of 16 years old who he couldn't afford bail, nor could his family, and he spent 3 years awaiting trial. 2 of those years in solitary confinement. Several times he tried to commit suicide, and then when he was discharged, because the city couldn't make a case, the DA couldn't build a case, that he committed suicide. And so this was a violation of his Sixth Amendment rights. Every American citizen has a right to a fair and speedy trial, and so the advocates for inmates were talking about this fundamentally something wrong with the system whereby the police and or district attorney's offices are overpromised and underfunded, and you have poor, low-income people, many of them are people of color and Latin folks, they cannot afford bail, and then because they can't go to trial quickly, with their legal aid lawyer, they plead for an offense they didn't commit. So this is how the system is inherently failing the residents of the city of New York, and that was their impassioned speech. And what they were asking for was justice, and it was just as moving the people who were representing the inmates as the people who were representing the correction officers. And what this means to me is that even though there are the first two groups, the board and the department, are aligned with each other, and the correction officers head and the correction officers and those representing the inmates, they may diverge from each other, but I see opportunities. I see opportunities to find common ground between all the groups, so we could move forward together in pragmatic reform. Before we move forward. In fact, we are going to move forward. We've completed Chapter 3. Let's go to Chapter 4. which is entitled What's Trending. So we've already pointed out in Chapter 3, the city brought the problems of Rikers Island upon itself because of ongoing violation of 6th and 8th Amendment constitutional rights of inmates. And so this helped, this constant drumbeat of publicity through the media, TV, internet, print journalism, led to what's happening at Rikers Island. It came to the top or near the top within the city and overall within the state, the need for reform and the need for change. And the mayor, a year ago, came out with a plan in which it's called Smaller, Safer, Fairer, the Roadmap to Closing Rikers. And what the mayor does is he tries to address all the problems. And since this was posted on the internet and introduced to the public and other stakeholders a year ago, it's going to take 9 to 10 years for this to follow up. That is, if we go by the city's timeline. So this is what it's about, and we're going to talk about reform now in Chapter 4, what's trending. So this is what's going on. Over the next 9 to 10 years, facilities in all 5 boroughs will be renovated, rebuilt, or built. And in addition, the population, the monthly census at Rikers Island, there are 10 jails there, needs to be winnowed down to 5,000 a month. And then at the same time, there need to be programs in place to cure the dysfunctional culture of Rikers Island, and it affects not only the 10 jails at Rikers Island and the 5 detention facilities throughout the 5 boroughs, but it's the overall criminal justice system affecting the city of New York. And so this is what needs to be done. First, there will be jail diversion programs. It first comes to judges, people who have been arrested on misdemeanor charges with a jail term of less than 30 days. It'll come before a judge, and then the judge will hand off the work to caseworkers who have a master's level degree in social work. And these are the things that they'll do to winnow down the population from 9 to 10,000 a month to 5,000 inmates on Rikers Island a month. And so this is what they're going to do. The jail diversion programs, people who are in this category who've been arrested on misdemeanors, they will be placed in programs for educational and vocational training. In addition, they'll be given opportunities to work in transitional jobs. And the third area is many people who are in this category are hungry, poor, jobless, and homeless, and they will be given an opportunity to receive mental health treatment and or treatment for drug and alcohol abuse. These are people who will be diverted from Rikers Island and will receive this off-island and will be free from jail, but they will be expected to comply with this program. And at the same time, in the mayor's plan, it's all on the internet, 18 bullets and a 53-page plan. What will also happen is people who are already incarcerated, who are awaiting trial, or they've been sentenced and they're serving their sentence, the same programs will be available to them, most of them, not all of them, but most of the same programs will be available to people who are already incarcerated in Rikers Island. And the only thing that I haven't been able to determine is whether the caseworkers will be assigned to work with inmates, whether they will have a master's level degree. But that's the other point. The last point is, let's talk about correction officers under the mayor's plan. Correction officers have a very stressful job, and they've taken a lot of criticism. So what the mayor's plan is, it's not only proposed, but it's being implemented along with the other plans I've mentioned. What the mayor's plan talks about for new correction officers and for veterans, what needs to be done is there needs to be ongoing skill-based training to help people, correction officers, in this category who has very stressful jobs, and it will focus in on psychologically, correction officers will be able to better handle and manage vulnerable populations, including women, teenagers, and people with various mental health and drug addictions. And in addition, they'll understand how to handle situations with inmates who are difficult to supervise, and who it's necessary for a court officer to put hands on the inmate so they could do it in an appropriate fashion that is approved by federal, state, and city authorities. So this is really good training, and it's a good way of responding to a lot of the criticism correction officers have been receiving, and I presume the correction officers union and the members are in favor of all this. In addition, what's going to be offered correction officers is the same kind of services that the inmates are receiving. And what I'm talking about is the correction officers will have a team of mental health professionals that will help them. It will help them. So they have a very stressful job, so it'll help them. So every day they come into work, they can bring their A game. And also, because it's a very difficult job to do, when they go home, they won't bring their work with them. And so it's all very important. And having this mental health help provided by the city, and it doesn't come out of their pockets, is a really positive sign. Now, before we close Chapter 4, what's trending, let's talk about statewide. There is a need for reform, and there needs to be more conversation among the stakeholders. And eventually, at the end of this conversation, it's going on now and it will continue into the future. At some point in the future, what needs to be done is the state legislature and the governor need to address the need for bail reform, probation reform, as well as speedy trial and discovery reform. So we have a chance, if we can make effective reform, to ensure greater equity, opportunity, and justice in the criminal justice system, which includes police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jails, prisons, so we can ensure greater opportunities for rehabilitation and greatly minimize the prevalence of recidivism. So that about summarizes Chapter 4, what's trending. Let's go to Chapter 5. In conclusion, you know, the thing about this research, there's a lot that I've learned that we're not using today because we're budgeting ourselves to 30 minutes or so with this talk. But the thing that's interesting is the New York Times has articles about what they're doing in other states that are northern and Democrat, Connecticut and California, states that are southern and Republican, Louisiana and Texas. And what I'm finding is that what's going on in other states affects the same kind of issues. It aligns with what we're doing in the city of New York and what needs to be done with the state of New York, and we covered that in Chapters 3 and 4. So I find it encouraging to see that there is reform, and what I get out of all this is that issues of tough on crime, soft on crime are irrelevant. So the thing about it is, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of states it's a winning issue for politicians, Democrat, Republicans, liberal, conservatives, to be tough on crime. In the 80s and 90s, because of the prevalence of drugs, we instituted maximum minimum sentences, and we built far more prisons, and we became tough on crime. And what we realized is that the prisons are overcrowded, and because we're tough on crime, we made a perhaps mistake of including low-level drug offenders with mid-level drug traffickers and drug kingpins. And the low-level drug offenders are frequently arrested on possession, and they have sentences close to or equal to mid-level drug traffickers and drug kingpins. And so these people's sentences shouldn't be as harsh. And also, in terms of rehabilitation, what even the most conservative red rock Republican states, they're realizing is that the prisons are bursting at the seams, and that it's much more cost effective to provide for rehabilitation, to provide therapies on an outpatient basis, outside of the jail and the prison, and to end the sentences earlier and provide supportive governmental services so people can they won't be addicted to alcohol or drugs, and other services under rehabilitation. So people can we could since it doesn't seem likely we're going to eliminate completely recidivism, but we will change the numbers and reduce the prevalence of recidivism. So it's very encouraging to realize what they're doing in other states, and so the thing about it is that the issues of tough on crime, soft on crime, is irrelevant. It's sort of like, how do we do this, and how do we take people who've been arrested, who are part of the system, and make them part of the system so they are tax-paying, law-abiding, employed people who if they choose to have marry, have kids, and all that, and make them whole and make them mainstream parts of society. We have 2.4 million people who are incarcerated in federal, city, state jails and prisons, and we have the highest incarceration rates in the world. And the thing about it is, to change the situation, reform is going to happen a little bit at a time. It's not going to happen overnight. Let me conclude with a couple of thoughts. The president, in his State of the Union address, it was surprising, and he said pretty much the same things we're talking about today. He said that people who paid their debt to society, who are leaving jail or prison, deserve an opportunity to be rehabilitated and be whole with society. And I endorse that, and it'll be interesting to see over the next two plus years during the remaining years of the Trump administration to see what Congress and the president propose in terms of authorization language, what that really means, and in terms of funding for existing and or new programs. And so just to get back to what we said in the opening remarks, this is not a handout, it's a leg up. And as I say to some people who are concerned about increase of taxes and paying for free government programs for people who've committed crimes, and what we're doing is we're condoning a moral hazard. What I suggest to people who differ from my ideas is that we're already paying for it. Either we build more prisons at the way things are going, we build more prisons and incarcerate more people, or we institute programs for effective governmental actions that are monitored closely so we stay on program and on budget. These are the things that we need to do. That's what I'm proposing. So we've covered just about everything we need to talk to today. There's a lot of things to talk about, but I'm sure we'll have other YouTube talks about this. I want to thank everybody for staying with me over the past 30 plus minutes. It's been a pleasure talking to you. My name is Michael Smook. I'm speaking from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today is June 10th. It's a Sunday, and we're in the year 2018. This is episode 25, and borrowing from the President's State of the Union address, it's appropriately called Second Chances. So until next time, goodbye and good luck.